Hi everyone, my name is Christopher Shane Priya, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about the case for the metric system. Now, when it comes to America, we always like to do things our own way. As one of the defining qualities about us is our independence. We don't like to feel that anyone can tell us to do anything that we're not destined to do. And nowhere is this kind of more evident, surprisingly, than in America's case with the metric system. Now, there's been a large debate over that that's been going back literally for centuries. There was an author who wrote a book last year in 2014 named J.B. Marciano called Whatever Happened to the Metric System, and he goes in depth into the history of the situation. For example, back when America was first formed, founding fathers such as George Washington wanted to use the metric system. It was a new version of measurements that had been created by the French earlier in that about, say, 10, 20 years ago, and they thought it worked well. But Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. He was the one responsible for determining which unit of measurements we would have, and he determined that they were too French. So because of that, we used the standard English measurements that they'd already had in place and had been around for hundreds of years, and it's continued on to this day. Now, the funny thing about that is 95% of the world now uses the metric system. There are only 3 countries which don't use it, and those would be Burma, Liberia, and the United States. So which one of those doesn't fit? Literally the entire industrialized world uses the metric system except for us. And there's various reasons for that, and we're going to go into that here. So what we're going to examine are just looking at the units themselves, how English measurements match up against the metric system, how the system has proliferated over the globe over the centuries, and then the reasons why America, even to this day, still hasn't fully adopted that. So let's start with the metric system and looking at that versus the English system and seeing how the metric system can be easier and more efficient to use. When it comes down just strictly to measurements by itself, our traditional English system we have now has a lot of measurements we have to remember. For example, anything in length, you can use inches or feet or yards. When it comes to mass, you're looking at pounds or tons or ounces, or volume and liters, gallons, and so forth. And those are just the quick ones that people are familiar with. There's probably another 8 or 9 in each category that you could use. When it comes to the metric system, you have one base for each set of measurements. So for length, you do the meter. For volume, cubic meter. For mass, you do the gram. And while you may have to stick some prefixes on them, depending on what you're doing, like say centimeter or kilometer or kilogram, whatever it is, that's all you have to do is add that prefix on. You don't change the base. And that by itself makes it easier to remember than the English system. This also applies into when you compare decimals and fractions. Decimals are part of the metric system, fractions are part of the English system. We already use it in our currency every day because it's so much easier to do so. For example, if you took 33 cents and plus 31 cents equals 64 cents. It's 0.33 plus 0.31 equals 0.64. Not so easy in fractions. The fractional equivalent of that would be 1/3 plus 5/16 equals 31 over 48. So I don't know about you, but I would rather get 0.64, 64 cents back than 31 over 48 of a cent back. And then when you have to convert it, it's just as simple. When it comes to decimals, you merely have to move the decimal point. So 0.64 times 100 is 64. You move the decimal point to the right 2 places. When it comes to fractions, you don't want to try and do 31 over 48 times 100 because it's going to be a little bit of a mess. And then also, when it comes to decimals, they all have just one value. If you're looking at half of something, it's 0.5, where under the English system, you can have 1 over 2, 2 over 4, 4 over 8, 8 over 16, and so on. All of them equal 0.5, but you have a ton of different numbers for that one value. So it's much easier to just say, here's the 1 and that's it. And this comes into play, especially when you're trying to convert between the two systems. One of the familiar ones for people when they've gone to school and taken a math or science class involves temperature. If you're looking at Celsius, there's a complicated formula to have to transfer Fahrenheit degrees into Celsius degrees, and vice versa. And this can cause a lot of problems when it comes to various things, such as in the science program back in 1999, we had a Mars orbiter, which had just arrived at the planet. The problem was, when it got there and they were getting ready to put it into orbit, the two teams working on it, one was working in the English system, one was working in the metric system, and they didn't know the other wasn't working in the same one. So when they did their calculations, they messed up and the orbiter burned up. That was a $125 million mistake caused by a math error. And if they had both been on the same standard of units, maybe that wouldn't have happened in the first place. So now that we've looked a little bit at the conversions and the numbers themselves, let's look a little bit at the adoption of the metric system over the globe. Now, back in the 1970s is when the real push began for the metric system. Most world governments, including the United States, wanted to try and get a standardized unit of measurement to try and reduce conversion errors, to make trading easier, to reduce confusion, just general confusion among their countries. If everyone used the same unit of measurement, things would be a lot easier. So for example, in America in 1975, Gerald Ford instituted the Metric Conversion Act, which was designed to try and get businesses, schools, every place in America to adopt it, and this similar programs are going on in other countries. Now this was done through a number of different methods. There was taught through education in schools. There was official inspections done by government offices to make sure people were using the metric system. There was ideological promotions that were put forth, and there was also a large sum of money spent by the government to purchase items that were in metric units, so that way they'd be available for people to use. So most other countries that we've seen on the previous slide have already converted, but America is still one of only 3 that hasn't done it. So if there was such a concerted effort, and if everyone else did it, then why isn't America using the metric system more readily? And there's a few thoughts on that, and again, this is also mentioned by J.B. Marciano in his book, that there's issues of expense. Companies will say that it is too expensive to have to convert all of their devices and materials over to the metric system, which is in part true. But they've been giving this argument for literally 250 years that they've been wanting to convert to the metric system. They're saying it's too expensive, that they have to switch all the signs, that there have to be new laws. And certainly with any sort of change, there is initial expense that goes into making that. However, ultimately, it probably might have been cheaper than the $125 million space probe we lost because we couldn't make up our minds on which one we wanted to use. So there's only so far as that argument goes. There's also that the United States, for most of its existence, has had a dominant economy. Americans often believe that if we're the ones who have the power and the influence, why should we have to change to fit anyone else? And this goes into ideas of our national sovereignty. People may think that if we convert, then we're somehow giving part of that up and bringing ourselves down to the rest of the world, which is a concern that Marciano makes in his book. Apparently, even in the 1970s, the opponents of the metric system, when all of the laws were being implemented, said that it could lead to Russian invasion. It could facilitate it if they decided to attack the United States. And I don't know about you, but I doubt if Russia ever invaded the United States that the use of the metric system would be the tipping point on which they would be able to win a conflict. So, just off a few of those examples, this shows why there's not a whole lot of merit to any of the arguments Americans put forth on why they don't want to use the metric system. It's more just a matter of personal choice. The metric system is already well established in America. We've seen it, like I mentioned, with currency and decimals. Any government organization which has a broad international presence, such as the Department of Defense, NASA, those ones have already completely converted to the metric system. They don't use English units anymore. But there are still various places which fight that. There's the Department of Education, which leaves it up to the states, and the states mostly have just left things status quo. And businesses with the aforementioned costs involved have largely decided to just leave things as they are. And this can become more troublesome as things go, because the world is becoming more interconnected every day. Our kids are going to grow up in a world where you're going to have to deal with different countries and different rules and different laws. And if you're having to worry about the metric system on top of that, when you don't really have to, isn't really something that so much effort should be used in fighting against. Again, we're the only one of the industrialized countries left which uses the metric system. And so if we were to have more uniformity in this particular case, that might make life easier, not just for us, But again, for our children who are going to grow up in that global economy, and we can avoid a lot of confusion and consternation between us and other countries if that's something that we could eventually achieve. Now, this comes up pretty much every year, every election cycle in Congress. There's always a push to adopt the metric system, so it is something that's continually thought about. Again, that's conversation, however, it's been going on for several hundred years. But if you're interested in learning about that, or get more information, or finding out how you can possibly contribute to having things switch over to the metric system for the future, you can always contact your local congressman. Or national organization is the U.S. Metric Association, www.metric.org, where you can find a whole lot of information about how you can be involved, if that's something you find interesting. And then also, for us Colorado residents, they're actually based out of Colorado State University up in Fort Collins. So that's something fairly close to home that obviously they have strong feelings about. But overall, that's my talk about the metric system. Again, my name is Christopher Shea Priya. I appreciate your time and thank you for listening.